How would you define the word theology? The study of God at its basic, right? The study of God, how we understand God. There are many different kinds or types of theology. You're sitting in an ELCA Lutheran church, so we often preach ELCA Lutheran theology. We talk about Protestant theology. Martin Luther, the roots we have as Protestants protesting the injustices of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. There's feminist theology, a theology that seeks to highlight how women are prolific in the Bible and how the patriarchy has tried to silence and ignore those voices. Feminist theology seeks to lift those voices up. Liberation theology by the late, great Gustavo Gutierrez highlighted the importance of all of the messages of the Bible that are about liberation and freedom, especially for the oppressed. And today we get to wrestle with Black liberation theology and James Cone. It is one of my responsibilities as your pastor to introduce you to, if you don't already know, all the varieties of theology. Because at the root, theology is mired in is steeped in our context, where we come from, right? Our skin color, our ethnicity, the oppression that we experience, our identities, how we grew up, whether or not we grew up with Christianity. There's deconstruction theology these days, people who are moving away from fundamentalistic religions, trying to find something better and deeper, and trying to let go of the oppressiveness of Christianity that they were raised in. It's my job, again, to introduce you to those theologies so you can find yourself, find your voice, so that you can create a faith that challenges and inspires you and comforts you, depending on what you need. Our faith gets to do all three of those things: challenge, inspire, and comfort us. Bring us joy, okay? So James Cone, incredible person. He describes his upbringing in his own words. If you are not familiar with his story, who he was, he grew up in 1920s segregated Arkansas. There's a fantastic YouTube video where he talks about his upbringing. March 17th, a lecture he gave at St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. It's pretty easy to find. But in it, he talks about his upbringing, about how he loved being Black. He loved listening to the blues music. He loved watching Jackie Robinson play baseball. The church that he grew up in, the AME Zion Church, spoke beautifully and powerfully about the spirituality and the goodness of being Black. But right outside the doors of his house, obviously, was a horrific other reality about how Black people were treated. His father was arrested and spent much of his time fighting to desegregate the local public school. So James Cone grew up in a household where he didn't hear that Black people were less than. He understood the struggle that it was to fight against white supremacy and white nationalism. In much of his theology and how he understood himself, he had a passion for who God was. And so he wanted to be a pastor. He wanted to study theology. And he went to a mainstream white college where he heard very little of anything about Black spirituality or Black theology. He was in his 30s when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And up to that point, he was a pacifist. He aligned with the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. But then, like many Black people of his time, became very angry and very frustrated. And James Cone vowed to bring what he saw and what he believed as the goodness of Black people into the mainstream conversation. For Professor Cohn, who was a professor at Union Seminary in New York City, for James Cone, he saw that Christ was not the Christ of white supremacy. He believed at the core of who he was that Christ would never be okay with lynching, with hate-fueled racism that he saw in America. And he wrote several books about this. I highly commend to you a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It's a difficult read, especially for all of us who are white, to have to hear and to learn and to learn about Black pain and Black struggle in our country. But it was an incredible book, because what he does is he starkly compares lynching trees to the cross, right? The cross, where Jesus was executed as a criminal of the empire, he compares it to lynching trees, right? Trees that were all over the American South, where Black people were hung, executed, usually without trial, their bodies left there for days as a show of power and reminder to the Black people about what their place was, and that if they even just looked at a woman in the wrong way, they would also suffer the same fate. James Cone also extended his theology, his Black liberation theology, he extended it to all who are suffering. And he challenged mainline theology to focus on the oppressed. He said, God is a God of the oppressed. Look at how Jesus lived his life and who he sided with and who he spent time with. And so in his later years, he also advocated for our gay and our trans siblings. In the early 2000s, he was a voice for peace for Palestinians. As you can imagine, he faced an incredible backlash and pushback and discreditation. And paired with your knowledge now of Cone, James Cone, and who he was, of Black liberation theology, we have a reading from 1 Corinthians. A reading which could use a little bit of background and explanation. The church in Corinth in Greece was located in a very diverse area. That church was founded by Paul. Paul spent 18 months in Corinth. It was co-founded with women. It was one of the many first great churches of the first century that tried to be egalitarian, to make a place in a community where people were equal, where they shared what they had. They gathered and they worshiped. They shared a form of communion like the similar one that we share every Sunday. And people were welcomed in no matter their background. When Paul moved away, as you might expect, conflict arose about, guess what? Power. About theology. Who baptized who? Who's more important? Who was the best leader? And they also were in conflict about behavioral standards. See, Corinth is a kind of a quirky little city, very cosmopolitan, but also right next to the temple, the shrine of Aphrodite, where in order to worship at that temple, there was a lot of promiscuity, a lot of behavior that Christians of the time weren't so okay with. And the people, the Church of Corinth, started to slide back into that behavior, and they began to fight about it. So all that context, 15th chapter of this letter, 14 chapters before this, he has been explaining and reminding them, calling out the issues, reminding them of their goodness as a church community. And he says in these verses, people of Corinth, remember why you are gathered. Remember that message that was first given to you. Forget all of the adiaphora, all the extra stuff. And remember these three things: Christ crucified, Christ risen. That is the heart of your purpose and who you are, of why all of this started. That is the heart of what you believe and why you believe, and the spark that should move your hearts. But here you are arguing and fighting and dividing yourselves. And he says something very stark to them in verse 3. He says, "So have you come to believe in vain?" To believe in vain. What does that mean? For Paul and the church in Corinth, it is knowing and feeling and hearing the message of Jesus' teachings, and then his death and his resurrection, and then forgetting all that and not allowing that to be the center of your motivation in life. Paul is calling them out because they're getting stuck in the trappings of the world, of wealth and influence, being seduced by their wider culture, and reverting back to the status quo. And the same was true for James Cone for his experiences witnessing the violence and the hatred levied against black people while working in mainstream academia. He saw that God is not, James Cone saw that a God who is not aligned with the hurting and the oppressed is a God that is merely a tool for the oppressors to use against others. I'll say that again. A God that is not aligned with the hurting and the oppressed is a God that is merely a tool for the oppressor to use against others. Cone reminds us to keep the crucified and suffering God before our eyes, and to look for suffering in the world and in our communities and in our schools, and seek to listen, learn, and serve, to be compassionate to the point of action and actively seeking justice. Now, most of this isn't new. I read him in seminary. I struggled with his writings in seminary. I took classes with black professors. But it breaks my heart that his writings are now more relevant today than I think they were back in 2012 when I was in seminary. We are seeing now in our country white supremacy rearing its ugly, sinful head again. We are seeing the arresting, the caging, and the hurting of our non-white siblings in this country. We are seeing our government unabashedly showing its racism in many and various ways. Our current government has been passionate about dismantling all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, trying to rewrite American history and downplay the effects of slavery and segregation and racism in our country. I could go on. I know all of you are paying attention to what is happening in our country. And it's heartbreaking. Paul said in the year 50 when the letter to Corinth was written, "Have you come to believe in vain?" He reminds us to root ourselves and ground ourselves in the teachings of Christ, in the cross, and the resurrection, all three of those things at once. When we continue to root ourselves in Jesus' teachings of nonviolence, of focusing on the stories of the oppressed and lifting up their voices when their voices are silenced, if we continue to focus on the cross, to care for the oppressed, then that resurrection thing, that eternal life that is promised to all of us when we die, but also that resurrection thing that is daily life, that resurrection thing is the promise that no matter what other humans do or continue to do, no matter what evils and racism we continue to root out, God always has the last word. Love and liberation always have the last word. I started this sermon asking about theology. Our hymn for the day that we're about to sing is called "Look Who Gathers at Christ's Table." The hymn we're about to sing is a beautiful picture of the world that God is trying to create. And we are called, friends, as Prince of Peace, to look around the table, to listen to the stories of others, even when those stories are hard to hear. We are called to do what we can to dismantle white supremacy, to be a place when it feels so hopeless, to be a place where God's justice and love start right here. It might seem small against the monster of racism and white supremacy that we're facing, but we have our hope, friends. That is how Christ works. That is how Christ has always worked. So I invite you to stand and sing this beautiful song and continue to live and be a church where all are welcome at Christ's table. Amen.